Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and welcome back to Goose Junkies episode 34. Tonight we have an extra special episode, and I cannot wait to discuss what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be looking at stuff pre Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark? And what I'm referring to is the platinum age of kids horror. Yes, stuff from pre 1991 and older. But today we're going to be looking at stuff from the 1980s, and we're going to be looking at two horror anthology shows from that time period: Twilight Zone and Tales from the Dark Side. We're going to be facing off the Shadow Man from Twilight Zone against um, the Cutty Black Sow from Tales from the Dark Side. I'm joined tonight by two of my favorite people in the horror community. Sadly, Micah cannot join us tonight, and um, Spongy has taken a bit of a hiatus from the podcast, so we don't have anything written from Spongy. But as always, we have my good friend, the Horrorlander, and we have a special guest, Austin, also known as Monster Blood. How are you boys doing tonight?
Yo, 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 people and patrons of the night, how are y'all doing? First of all of y'all should be tuning in. Because for those of you who don't know, we got a unicorn here. We got a dragon. We got a rare sighting. My boy Monster Blood. He is currently on a hiatus from his channel, but he's here and joining us, and we're very appreciative for that. So, how are you doing, my brother?
I'm doing pretty good and I'm excited to be here.
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yes, sir.
We pull him out of semi-retirement for this episode.
Yeah.
That's right.
And we joke about him being Gramps, but listen, he might have been around for when these episodes were airing because this is before our time, man. This is back when it all started. So hope you guys are excited. I don't know if a lot of you have seen these episodes before, but if you've not, you guys will learn a lot about them tonight. So be ready.
Oh yeah. So, what's interesting, and I've always thought this, is that we are all horror anthology fans. And we've been talking about these shows for years at this point, I feel. It seemed like years ago when I started casually watching Tales from the Dark Side, and then everybody in our Discord chat started watching along with the show. And it's been fun to hear other people's thoughts as they come across these episodes and what have you with this show in particular, because I think we're all in agreement that Tales from the Dark Side is not the strongest show ever made. And I think we've all said our piece involving that. But when it comes to 80s Twilight Zone, this is more new territory for me. I've been casually watching here and there episodes when I have some downtime and if I'm in the mood. Um, but I'm starting to get into the swing of it and starting to actually sit through the entire episodes, and I'm not cherry picking certain segments. So yeah, that's been a daunting task because 80s Twilight Zone has on average 3 segments an episode, and they run 48 minutes. Jesus, man, it's like 2-part Goosebumps episodes for the most part. So it's a lot of content to sift through. But yeah, so I guess we'll go ahead and start with what we're going to talk about. Like I said, we're going to talk about the Shadow Man versus the Cutty Black Sow. Now, the reason why we're facing these two Platinum Age kids horror stories off together is because of two factors. One, it's basically urban legend centered stories with kid protagonists. And what's cool about this time period in kids horror was the fact that there was no direct kids horror market. Kids had to find stuff that what we know and understand nowadays as kids horror within horror made for adults. So there would be scattershot episodes in these adult horror anthology shows from time to time that actually appeal to kids. And sometimes they became controversial, as we'll discuss later on with the next episode we're going to talk about. But we might as well go ahead and start with the Shadow Man from Twilight Zone. Now, I'll pass it over to whoever wants to take this one over. What's Shadow Man about, and what's your thoughts on it?
I guess I can take this one. So this one basically opens up with a main protagonist who's your typical sort of nerdy guy. He's very smart, very forward thinking, but he pretty much is getting shunned by everybody and made fun of by everybody. In particular, there's a girl, the local hot girl in their school that he likes, and he's hoping to get a chance with her and possibly date her. But what happens one night is that as he's about to go meet her, some local bullies, particularly one of his enemies, basically sets up a prank where they scare the life out of him in front of the girl. So he basically ends up looking like a baby, looking like a wuss, and he takes that to heart. So one night, as he's basically relaxing in bed and kind of feeling down on his luck, a really weird, terrifying thing happens. Something that you would think is sleep paralysis, but turns out to be something worse. Basically, this all shadowy figure crawls out of his bed, and it is completely made out of darkness, even in the light. It does not have any recognizable features. It looks like a tall man in a trench coat with a hat on, and the only thing that this shadow man has deemed to say basically repeats to the kid is that I shall not hurt who's anybody whose bed that I sleep under, basically reassuring the boy that he's not going to hurt him despite his menacing appearance. And he ends up going out the window. Now, of course, the main character is a little bit shocked by this and surprised, but he kind of just treats it as maybe he was hallucinating, maybe he was dreaming, whatever it may be. But the next day, when he's in school and he's walking around basically, the premises, he hears all these different kids basically talking about some maniac on the loose, some what seems to be serial killer or serial assaulter that's basically been attacking people and actually broke a kid's arm. So right away he starts to put two and two together and realizes that because they're saying that this person had no recognizable features, that it was probably that shadow man from under his bed. And he starts realizing that there might be some malevolent force that's gotten released. He doesn't understand what it could be, but as the days go on, he sees that he's completely immune to getting attacked because of what the thing said. I'm not going to harm those whose bed I sleep under, and everybody else is basically getting attacked. So because he starts to look brave, since he knows he has no fear about the Shadow Man, now he starts to become popular on campus. He starts getting things his way. But has he bitten off more than he can chew? With great power comes great responsibility. And how is that exactly going to play out with the climax and ending? So that's essentially the plot of The Shadow Man. And just for my own personal opinion, oh my God, where has this episode been all my life? Because I absolutely fell in love with this episode. It has an urban legend concept, which for those of you who don't know, I'm in love with urban legends. It all started since I had read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark as a kid. I fell in love with urban legends since that moment. And anytime there's a story that revolves around it, it's got like a sweet spot in my heart. I also think that all the characters in this episode are well acted, and I like the main character. He's pretty likable, your typical sort of rootable protagonist. If there's anybody that I could compare him to, even though he predates this person, I'd compare him to that guy from The Tale of the Dead Man's Float, the main character in that, who same kid actor played in Welcome to Camp Nightmare. Your typical sort of rootable nerd. And on top of that, I think that the story is well structured. I did not feel bored at any point. I feel like it's a perfect package of a story. The Shadow Man is very terrifying, very ominous. And I love the fact that there's all these like talks going around of a maniac hurting people because that reminded me of the real life inspiration for Scream. For those of you who don't know, on a Florida university campus in real life, there was a serial killer running around hurting people, and everybody started getting paranoid and making up stories. That's kind of what it feels like here with the Shadow Man, except of course toned down. So I thought that was pretty cool. And the ending to the story actually feels like the ending to an urban legend, which you don't often see. Not going to spoil what that is, but there's been some debate about this ending, as Comp informed me about. People got their own different interpretations, but I actually really enjoyed the ending. So overall, I'd give this episode a 9.5 out of 10. I genuinely think this is timeless, and if you're looking for some good kids horror that not a lot of people have probably talked about around you outside of your normie stuff like Goosebumps, Afraid of the Dark, and Haunting Hour, you should go check this out because I genuinely think you guys will enjoy it. And it's not holding back any punches. It goes quite dark, so that's also a positive. And those are my thoughts. So let me pass it off to my brothers to see what they think.
Yeah, I'm gonna say that if you're watching anything from the Platinum Age for kids horror, expect some dark things to happen to children. Okay, that's a common thing you're gonna expect. Okay, just know that, audience, before you go watch any of these. All right, um, it's going to be a rude awakening if you're not prepared. I'll go ahead and pass it over to Austin. Hey, what's your thoughts on the Shadow Man?
So, The Shadow Man, this was my first time diving into the 80s Twilight Zone. For those of you watching who maybe don't know, I'm a huge fan of the original Twilight Zone. I've seen every episode, some multiple times. This was my first time checking out the 80s reboot of the show. And I will just say that I am curious now to check out more of this show. I didn't quite love the episode as much as BD, but I thought it was pretty cool. It has this kind of like fairy tale, like fantasy aspect to it a little bit, to where you don't really get a lot of backstory or explanation behind the Shadow Man, or who he is exactly, or where he comes from. He just kind of magically appears from under this kid's bed. And I also like the themes that it has about like bullying and the kid wanting to take revenge on these kids. And yeah, I kind of like the concept to it. It was pretty cool, pretty creepy. I did have a few like minor negatives with it though. I think it was a little bit too ambiguous for my taste. I would have liked a little bit more explanation. I think things were just left a little bit too open ended. I do like some ambiguity in certain stories. It kind of just depends, I guess. But at this one, I feel like it was just left a little bit too open ended for my tastes. And also, I think it lacked a little bit in like character development. And I don't think it explored like these themes of bullying and revenge as well as it could have, and how this kid wants to take revenge on these kids, but it kind of like backfires on him. And like these bullies, they just kind of like tease him a little bit, and like I think they jump out and scare him. Like I feel like we don't really get enough reason or like convincing acts for him to want to like pursue revenge and like what follows upon that. So yeah, I don't know. I was just a little bit disappointed in some of that character stuff and like the overall execution of this idea. But I do think it's a really cool concept, and it definitely has you thinking a little bit like about kind of the origins of the Shadow Man and where things go by the end of the story. Overall, I think I gave this one like a flat three, kind of a high three, maybe like a 3.25 out of 5. Again, I thought it was good, but like on the lighter side of good. I didn't love it quite as much as BD did, but I thought it was a good episode, and I am curious to check out more of this Twilight Zone series, the 80s version. And I noticed too that it was a little bit shorter than an average TV episode. I think it was like 18 or 19 minutes, if I remember correctly, where it seems like most TV episodes are like 20 to 22 minutes around there. So I don't know if maybe being a little bit shorter kind of hurt it a little bit and left out some of that like space where it could have developed the characters a little bit more. I don't know. But yeah, I thought it was good. Nothing great, but I enjoyed it for what it was. Just some of those flaws kind of held it back for me to keep me from like loving it. So yeah, those are my thoughts on the Shadow Man.
Yeah, great
I'm right
points.
there. I'm right there with you too. It was my first time watching this Twilight Zone show because, like Monster Blood, I think we both have seen the old show, but I'm with them too, man. Excited to watch this new show in the future. So yeah.
Yeah, I have a really big soft spot for 80s Twilight Zone. From what I've seen so far, the biggest hurdle for me, I think, getting into the show was the fact that majority of the episodes, not all of them, but majority of them are three segmented. So you have to sacrifice some minutes on some good stories that probably could use some more that you want more out of. So you can make room for like a little filler second episode usually within the episode, and then you have an equally long third segment. I've never been a fan of that, as I've already dived into, I think, 9 episodes at this point complete. I am not a fan of it. However, there are some episodes that just have two stories, which are, I think, naturally longer and a bit better inherently. And I wish this episode had like 25 minutes to roll with, because there's a lot of potential, I think, that was potentially scrapped, because you had some big powerhouse people involved with this episode. You know who directed this episode? Joe Dante, the guy who made Gremlins. I mean, the guy who made Small Soldiers. The guy's a legend. He makes fantastic movies. One of my favorite movies from him, and it's probably the most underrated one in my opinion, is Matinee. I love that film to pieces. He's a great creator, and him directing this episode shocked me the first time I heard about it. But I also heard that this was like the scariest Twilight Zone episode out of any incarnation of the show. And this goes from the original Rod Serling series all the way through Jordan Peele's run. And I'm like, okay, that's a tall order. Let me go check this out. Is this the scariest? Now I'm going to say this. if you've only ever seen the original Twilight Zone in this show and nothing else in horror, I mean, nothing else, you haven't watched Dark Side, you haven't watched Crypt, none of the other shows, I can see maybe due to your exposure, you could think this is the scariest. But to me, this just felt like textbook Goosebumps from start to finish. And I noticed it the first time I watched. I'm like, this literally feels like a Goosebumps book. Even the twist. We've seen dark twists like this in kids horror, and some of my favorite stories, like Werewolf Skin, The Tale of Vampire Town, it has the same twist here. And you know that's all that I'm all about that life. But after watching it a few times now, I want to say this, and I have to kind of agree with Monster Blood here. I think that the episode is kind of lacking with a thematic tie to really send it home. And I feel like with a longer segment or maybe some tweaks, this could have been like the greatest Platinum Age kids horror story ever. And I thought of a way that I think would heavily improve it. And all I would tweak is like the moment that Danny learns about the Shadow Man, he goes to follow it, and then he stumbles into his bullies who are dressed up as like, chainsaw killers. And then he witnesses the Shadow Man harm them, and he puts two and two together that, hey, he's not going to be harmed, but the Shadow Man takes care of bad people. And throughout the episode, we see him kind of adjust his moral compass. Like he starts to dictate right and wrong and judge who the Shadow Man takes care of. And he eventually becomes to the point where he's kind of in over his own head, and he thinks he's invincible, and he thinks that he can take out his crush's boyfriend, get him out of the picture because he's an asshole essentially, and wants to actually target him to be killed. But the twist would be his friend notices that he's changed and that he's not the same person, and maybe his friend assumes control of the Shadow Man and makes the call himself to end his friend because his friend is now a monster. And all the people that the Shadow Man has handled through the episode were bad people. And I would fit that theme into the Shadow Man's character and as well to Danny's downfall. That's the tweak I would make. But as is, it's still a story that's very reminiscent to what I call the loaded gun stories that you find in kids' horror. Like Greg Banks from the original Say Cheese and Die. When he has the camera, he has power in his hand. It's like a loaded gun. If he uses it, he's going to harm somebody. The Shadow Man's kind of a similar thought on that, and Danny understands that he's immune and that other people can get hurt, but he's unfazed by violence. He grows unfazed by it, and he actually welcomes it. He tries to invite his bully to essentially get killed by the Shadow Man at a park, and his bully has no idea. And that, I think, is where the power of this story lies, is that twist ending. When he gets his comeuppance for acting that way, it's deserved because he chose to pick violence over being better than it. And I think what the Shadow Man represents in the story is a metaphor of fear of violence. And if you don't fear violence and you welcome it, that's when violence essentially consumes you and it possibly can get you hurt. And quite literally, Danny gets hurt. So I think for that, it's still a well done story, but I just wish there was more to it. I wish they explored the characters a bit better. I'd probably give this tale here maybe like a 4 out of 5 stars. And that's with a blended kids horror asterisk and adult horror metric because it's an adult horror show, but I think because I'm judging it for kids horror, I'm gonna meet halfway there. I think this is a very exceptional episode, especially for 80s Twilight Zone standards. I think there's some episodes I love way more than this, and I can't wait for y'all to experience them. But yeah, that's all I have to say. Anything you want to add on to kind of wrap up this episode?
I'll say this: the one highlight to the episode was that playground scene. Man, I love that like mock Western face off between the two. It was so over dramatic, but that was pretty funny.
What about the whimsical music that they chose?
Oh, yeah.
like the 80s bop, like generic Saved by the Bell type song they played throughout the story. I'm like, wait, what? I never noticed that before until this time around. I'm like, wait, they actually carry that same boom, 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 boom. Like they carry that in the background whenever something tense is supposed to be happening. I'm like, why are they doing that?
It is pretty funny seeing the cast of characters because like we're so used to like 90s kids, so we know how they rock. But like watching this 80s show, like you see them wearing those classic leather sports jackets. It's almost like you're watching the cast to like a slasher movie, but it's toned down to middle school kids. It's pretty funny.
And it's also weird seeing like a kid's horror story with like kids with like girlfriends and stuff. That was kind of that took me back. I'm like, wait, Eric's like 13 years old and he has a girlfriend like that he's treating this seriously? Like, come on, man. I'm like, this is taking itself. Maybe they're supposed to be freshmen in high school. I don't think they ever explain really what grade they're in, nor does
Oh,
it really matter.
they said they were 13, so these
They
are
were
middle
13,
school.
okay. So
Yeah.
I don't know what grade that was back then, but um, it could still be eighth grade. But yeah, it felt a little dramatic at times, and I think what really sends me home about this being like Goosebumps adjacent is the fact that the caricatures and the stereotypes used are almost identical to what R.L. Stine uses on a regular basis in Goosebumps. Like Danny fits in with the typical nerd archetype that you'll see a dozen times and way more. And I thought that was funny. I was thinking to myself like maybe Stein took the blueprint from this. I don't know.
Never know.
Well, he did. He was doing a magazine back in the '80s, and I'm pretty sure they did cover '80s Twilight Zone in that magazine. So I want to be shocked if he had to watch certain shows to keep up with it, so he knows what he's editing in his magazine. But I think that's funny.
Hmm.
Anything else you want to add, Austin?
I will just say like the last twist ending there with the Shadow Man reveal and what happens to the main character. I don't know. I kind of had mixed feelings on it. I didn't mind it necessarily, but it felt kind of out of left field. I don't know. I wasn't really expecting it, but not in a good way. It wasn't like a welcome surprise, I guess you could say. But I think it does kind of go along with the sort of ambiguity of the Shadow Man himself, since he's not really explained that much throughout the episode. So I don't know. I can't really fault it too much for that. I guess it's just I don't know, just kind of a personal thing. I'm just sort of nitpicking at. It's just
Yeah,
something that didn't really like resonate with me, I guess. But
yeah. I'd say the closest thing that the twist reminds me of is if you've seen the Werewolf of Fever Swamp episodes ending, the ambiguity there, like what actually happened, is way up in the air, and there's supposed to be multiple interpretations. I feel like this episode also went for that. But I guess we can, briefly touch on the interpretations. Like, what did y'all think that the twist at the end means? Like in terms of the Shadow Man and what actually happened? Because there's like three different theories out there, like three different main ones, and I think they're all pretty interesting and kind of valid. Which brings to the point that Austin made, is that it's very ambiguous, which I don't know if it's like a stroke of genius or not, but there's multiple avenues about what you
I
can
mean,
interpret with it.
I could start off. I guess like the way I interpreted it was I interpreted it as like literally, because I know some people have taken it as like more symbolic, more metaphorical. But I had one time read a Grady Hendrix short story called Ankle Snatcher, and that one had to do with the boogeyman. And there was like a thing involving that short story where it wasn't boogeyman, it was like boogeymen. It was like a race of these things that used to haunt everybody's bed. And with the Shadow Man, the reason why I personally really like the ending, I was not expecting it, but when it came and I thought it over, I was like, well, the ending doesn't break any rules that they set up involving the entity, so it's pretty consistent. And they did not openly say, I mean, I guess we can talk a little bit about it. They did not openly say that the Shadow Man was the only thing out there. So it did not break any rules, which I appreciate. So I can't necessarily say that it's like bad for that reason. And again, I like it because if you've read stuff like, Goosebumps short stories, scary stories to tell in the dark, or other urban legends, they usually end with this type of ending. You rarely see a urban legend type of story in kids horror that actually ends like an urban legend. This one felt like that, so I can actually appreciate it for that. And I think you had brought up completionist, another interpretation about it, which I don't know if you'll talk about, but that one I think could also be a possibility. But I just took it as literally, so that's why I pretty much enjoyed it. And again, if they would have broken any rules, if they would have like been inconsistent, I would have been right there like with a bunch of people being like, "Oh yeah, this felt like out of left field, doesn't make any sense." But they didn't technically break any mechanics, so I'm willing to give it a pass.
Okay. so your interpretation, you took it literally. Monster Blood, how did you interpret the ending?
Yeah, I don't really have much else to add. I just kind of took it literally as well as it being like a different Shadow Man, I guess.
Mhm.
And then of course the main character coming to harm by that Shadow Man. And BD made a good point about not really breaking any rules because we don't really know that much about the Shadow Man or Shadow Men, I guess you could say, to begin with. So yeah, I don't know. I thought it was an okay twist. It didn't leave me feeling like satisfied for some reason. I didn't quite love it, but yeah, I didn't really think too much or look too much into like the theories and stuff about it. I know people that have different theories about like what happened, I guess, but I didn't really like read too much into that. So
You know, I think you guys are right on the money with it saying literally there was another Shadow Man, because that's why I have the thought I have. It's kind of a mix of taking like the metaphor into account with the fact that it's basically said he's a different Shadow Man, the one that we see in the ending. My thought was that the Shadow Man is implied to be some sort of accusative figure where somehow there has to be some underlying reason to speculate as to why he was under Danny's bed, right? And if you look at what the story's talking about with using violence and getting comfortable with violence, then you have to assume that because Danny stopped fearing the Shadow Man and stop fearing violence, that the Shadow Man, or I guess whatever one supports him, possibly wasn't there to defend his hide. Or there could be a different tweak to that where perhaps maybe he went and chose a different kid. Perhaps he chose, I think the bully's name was Eric. Maybe he was Eric's Shadow Man and he set him up. Maybe Eric knew through, maybe asking his Shadow Man to harm Danny. And maybe that's what happened. Maybe um, that's the case, or perhaps it could be that it was the same Shadow Man all along, but he became a new owner's Shadow Man. It's up to interpretation, but I think it's more on the line that it's a completely different one, and perhaps whichever one that Danny was associated with perhaps went away, or it wasn't there to help. And there has to be a reason. I think that's probably the more intriguing part about the ending is, well, why did Danny die if he had this help all along? Like what caused the Shadow Man to do that? Well, the episode gives you an answer. Oh, well, I'm not the Shadow Man that lives under your bed, but that leaves a little more questions there than people like I think give it credit. Like, okay, but then what happened to Danny's Shadow Man? What where where can you go with it? This is
I
a
think
perfect one you can build on in like a sequel episode or something.
I think another interesting thing too was like let's say let's imagine if it wasn't even the bullies. Let's say if it belonged to somebody else, it could have been another bullied underdog kid in the town. And I think that that's also like that. I think that actually works effectively too because the whole point of what the main character, the reason why he's acting the way he is, like Danny, is because it's his own life. So the way that he acts, he justifies it. But let's say if it was another bullied kid, technically Danny would be seeing a reflection of himself, like what he's actually doing to people. So that would also be interesting. We did not see who the other Shadow Man belonged to, but if we would have seen like there's another bullied kid that's abusing the power of the loaded gun, it pretty much would have been like a mirror in Danny's face. He would have seen like, oh crap, this is what I've become. This is what I'm doing. And by that point, it's too late. He gets killed. So
Well, thinking on it, his best friend, he like acts like a jerk to him before
mhm.
like the climax. It could be his best friend since he knows about the Shadow Man. He's the only person that really knows other than Danny. Perhaps that's enough for him to get his own Shadow Man, and perhaps it was his friend's Shadow Man that killed him.
That would
Could
have
be.
been cool.
See, that's why when I was telling you like how I would tweak it, I would involve the friend more because you can play up the moral in the lesson a bit harder with that because the friend sees that he's lost his friend to becoming somebody that is evil and he has to make a harsh decision. But also, I'll be using the Shadow Man as more of a literal gun because they can weaponize them because it's like their pet. But that's like the extent of the tweaks I was willing to go because I think the twist really does work. It's dark and it leaves you thinking. And if an episode is able to do that, it's going to stay with you and it's going to make you remember it. And that's all you can really ask for in a show that's giving you 3 segments in an episode. Good God Almighty, you're going to forget like half of this show by the time you're over with it. So I think this one's going to stand out for sure. So yeah, maybe it's a blessing and a curse, or maybe it's a stroke of genius. It's up to debate. But yeah, that was fun talking about the Shadow Man. So I think we're all in general thoughts that we really enjoyed this one, or mildly enjoyed it at least. So I guess we'll move on to Tales from the Dark Side. We'll move on to the Cutty Black Sow now. So the Cutty Black Sow, I think, came out after the Shadow Man did, and there's some similarities here. You have another urban legend centered one. This time, it's more rooted in Scottish folklore. For me, being a descendant of Scottish heritage, I am excited to see stuff like that, especially when you're using folklore in the mix. I love it when horror tries to experiment with that. It reminds me of what Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark would do. And it's kind of like a hybrid of that with a Goosebumps flair to it. Also, which I think this episode really encapsulates. I guess I'll go ahead and tell you what it's about. This episode actually features a very young protagonist for kids' horror standards. I mean, this kid has to be like, what, 8 years old at the oldest? And his name is Jamie. He has a younger sister named Gloria, and it's Halloween Eve, the night before Halloween. And his great grandmother is dying in her deathbed. And she's spouting what everybody seems to think is babble, but, Jamie's recording it, and he's taking all this information down because he thinks it could pertain to his family and pertain to the livelihood of them on Halloween the next day. So when Jamie's sent up to bed, he can't go to sleep. He goes down to visit his great grandmother, who is still making some noise. And she keeps babbling, but then tells him through that you need to be the guardian of the family. You need to listen to what I've told you when I go, because you're going to be the one to protect my soul in the afterlife, and you're going to protect the rest of your family and everybody else moving forward. So she passes her way in her dying breath, and that's very heavy for a little kid. I mean, I'm like an 8-year-old witnessing his grandmother dying in front of him. That's harsh. That's harsh reality stuff. And pretty much the very next day, his parents have to go to a funeral parlor to have to, get some stuff in order to bury the grandmother. So he's left home with his little sister and to prepare for trick or treating, but he's rummaging through his grandmother's things and notices like this very old leather-bound book that goes back at least 100 years. And he notices that there's been many family members that have written in it, and there's some words that he doesn't understand. So he has a dictionary looking up things that he's trying to make sense of. And he has his grandmother's audio recordings that he's made. And he starts to put together that there's this creature called the Cutty Black Sow that pretty much comes after his family on Halloween. And there's a certain ritual that they do where they have to put pebbles or in a circle in a fire pit, and they have to mark the stones. And the stones have to stay in the fire throughout Halloween, all the way up through midnight. And if they don't stay in there and one hypothetically falls out, then the Cutty Black Sow can come after them. So he takes it upon himself to do the ritual before he takes his sister out trick-or-treating. Well, of course, it backfires. When they get back, they notice one of the pebbles have fallen out, and Jamie realizes it's possibly his pebble. So he's like, oh crap, Gloria, go to bed. And he's going to try to wait out the storm. He's going to stay up all night and wait patiently. He's going to observe every noise, nook and cranny of the house to make sure that this Cutty Black Sow isn't coming for him. But we as the audience see that there might be some strange eyes glowing in dark places in this creepy house. And eventually, there comes a point in the story near the end where we find out what exactly is going to happen to Jamie as it pertains to the Cutty Black Sow. And it's dark. It does not hold back, just like the Shadow Man episode. Maybe not as graphic, but the implications are there. So yeah, I kind of want to save my thoughts because I know that Monster Blood really loves this episode. So I'm going to pass it over to Monster Blood before I share my thoughts. Tell me about Cutty Black Sow and what you like about it.
So, like Completionist already said, I absolutely love this episode. I think it's fantastic. I will admit up front that in the context of Tales from the Dark Side, the series as a whole, I think this episode, I probably give it more credit than it deserves, along with maybe some of my other favorite episodes, because I'll be honest, Tales from the Dark Side is not the best show as a whole. There's a lot of middling and even bad episodes in this show. So when you get to the good episodes, they seem like really, really good in comparison with some of the other stuff you have to watch. But anyways, the main thing that I like about this episode, it is rife with tension and this sense of like mood and atmosphere pretty much throughout the entire runtime of the episode. And it's just kind of unrelenting. Like Completionist mentioned, it opens up with a really dark note, this really somber note with this kid's grandmother basically dying right in front of him. And right before she passes away, she tells him the story of this Cutty Black Sow. And it kind of upsets him a little bit, kind of disturbs him. And he takes some precautions to try to like avoid a confrontation with this monster, to try to like deter it. And throughout the episode, we do get like some fake out scares and things that happen. Like there will be like a branch knocking on the window, for example, and some things that happen that the main character is led to believe maybe the Cutty Black Sow is real, maybe he's coming for him. And it's not annoying fake out scares like you would find in like a horror movie, like the stereotypical like booming noise. It startles the audience and it just feels like a cheap fake out scare that you're left being like very annoyed with. I feel like these type of fake out scares done in this episode are done very deliberately and with purpose, and they kind of help maintain that tension, and it kind of leaves the viewer like on the edge of the seat, wondering, you know, is the Cutty Black Sow real? Is this kid just seeing things? Is he freaked out? Like, what's going on here? And I think that the kid actors here do a pretty decent job, especially considering how young they actually are. You know, I don't know the exact ages of the actors or the characters in this episode, but they appear to be pretty young. I think Completionist mentioned like 8 or 9 years old, which sounds about accurate. They're pretty young. And yeah, this kid just has a lot of anxiety, but he also feels like he has this duty to like kind of protect his family, protect his sister. He feels like he has to kind of stand up, and he tells his sister at one point in the episode, like, you need to go to bed. And he decides to like kind of stay up and like keep an eye out for things. And I feel like they do a really good job conveying the emotions of the character to the audience. You know, you can clearly see that this kid is going through a lot of anxiety, a lot of fears over this old folk tale, and that translates pretty well to the viewer. I felt like very just kind of uneasy watching this, and this is the second time I've watched this episode now, and I think I actually appreciated it even more this time. I just felt a little bit creeped out, and that's saying something because I watch a lot of horror. It's not easy to like scare me, but this episode makes me feel just a little bit uneasy throughout. And then you get to like that final act and that climax, and I won't spoil exactly what happens, but I think it's done really well, executed very well. Basically, you have all of those little fake out scares throughout the episode, and then you get to the end, and you get to a point to where the main character, the young kid, he thinks he's safer. He gets to a point where he lets his guard down. He has a conversation with one of his parents, and he sort of confesses and unloads his fears and anxieties to his parent. And as the viewer, you also kind of let your guard down a little bit. You're not really expecting anything to happen. And then there's the twist, the big reveal of the episode. And it is absolutely terrifying, straight nightmare fuel. And it is just done so, so well. I absolutely love it. Super creepy. I love the creature. I love the old folk tale. I like almost everything about this episode. I do have a few like minor nitpicks with it, but nothing that's really like a huge deal. One of the things is that some of like the line delivery and dialogue from the kid actors isn't really the best, but I think part of that might just be the writing, the lines that they're given, and then of course too they are very young, so I can't be too harsh on them for like their acting when they're like 6, 7, 8 years old, whatever. And then also in like the climax of the episode when we get to the twist, although I like the twist a lot, I think the technique from like a more technical standpoint, the way that it's delivered, I think they could have handled it a little bit better. Just the way like the camera focuses on a certain thing that happens at the end and the way it's presented, again, from a more technical standpoint, it's hard to talk about without like spoiling it exactly. But I don't know. I think they could have presented it a little bit better, but really just minor nitpicks. And I do remember thinking the first time I watched this episode, I wish we had gotten a little bit more of like Halloween flair and Halloween vibes to it, because it does take place on Halloween night. And you don't really get that. Pretty much the entire episode takes place in a single setting inside of this house. But upon rewatch, I think I actually like that and appreciate that about the episode, because it adds to this sense of isolation and claustrophobia that these characters feel. And again, I think they do a really good job sort of conveying and translating those feelings and emotions to the viewer. And yeah, overall, I think I gave this episode like a 4.5 out of 5 stars. And it is one of my very favorite Tales from the Dark Side episodes, in my top 3. And again, I will admit, compared to a lot of the other episodes of this show, it seems probably a little bit better than it might actually be. But yeah, I love it. Cutty Black Sow is great.
Well, you gave it a glowing review like I thought you would, and I really do love this episode myself. I guess I'll get into my thoughts and then we'll pass it over to BD. Um, so I've actually read the short story and I've read the comic version of the Cutty Black Sow, which isn't too far off from this. But I will say that because this was on syndicated television, like other shows back then, but for Tales from the Dark Side, when I say because this is for syndicated television, I'm saying that because they had a low budget on syndicated television, they couldn't pull off every nook and cranny that, let's say, a comic would be able to with just drawing it, or the short story would be able to do just writing it, because you don't need a budget to do it. So they did cut out some considerable moments with the Cutty Black Cell, but I think the direction here for the episode was to kind of build up the tension and then break the glass with the twist by finally showing what it really looks like. And you get glimpses on the leather-bound book of an artistic depiction of it to kind of give you an idea or a rudimentary sense of what it might look like. So this is definitely an episode that's trying to predicate the mind a little bit. And I noticed that more this time around watching it. And I can appreciate that about the episode. And I have a lot of similar positives. My first big positive is the main character, Jamie. Given how young he is one of the very rarest of kids' horror protagonists you'll ever find, and that is the active hero. Somebody who willingly puts himself into, hard decisions and pretty much, risk-taking situations to make sure that people around him are safe. And that's a very mature thing for an 8-year-old boy to be handling by himself. He's essentially pulling the Kevin McAllister, right? He takes it upon himself to, try to protect his sister. He tries to protect his family members when nobody else is listening. And he's the one making the proactive measures to record his grandmother, to take notes, to do all of this. And he's proven right. I mean, like, the kid is proven right. His morals and his decisions are in the right place, so he's very rootable, and it makes the twist ending that much more heart wrenching. Like some of my favorite kids horror episodes and books, like The Tale of Vampire Town and Werewolf Skin, two of my all-time favorite kids horror stories. Great protagonists, active in the story, almost heroic, but they have horrible endings happen to them for some reason. Why? It's because, sometimes the soldier, they go into battle, they can have all the weapons, all the mindset, whatever have you, but you get hit with that stray bullet. I mean, you're a mortal man, so it's going to happen. It sucks, but I think it would have terrified kids, and I'm pretty sure it did, because fun fact about this episode, after this first airing, I learned about this way after I first watched this, mind you. Apparently, parents and kids complained about this story to the point where Paramount stopped re-airing the episode for a long time. Whenever it would re-air the episodes, and people didn't get to see this story until it ended up on Sci-Fi and Chiller Network. So some people thought that this was kind of like a urban legend out there, because they're like, I never saw an episode called The Cutty Black Sal, but people were like, no, 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 it was an actual episode, but it was like scary, and people were talking it up like it was the scariest Tales from the Dark Side episode. I can kind of see that, maybe, just maybe. Dark Side is not a scary show. Let's be real. It's a schlocky show. It's kind of like Creep Show, but not trying to undersell it. It can be scary at times. This is one of the ones I would actually call that. But to me, despite all the great things about the episode, I do think that where I would have wanted to see it personally go, to kind of differentiate it from the short story counterpart, given that Michael McDowell, of all people, is writing this, is to kind of expand it and add some things to it that is missing. One thing that I think I noticed in the episode, and I know Monster Blood kind of touched on it, is that the mid portion, when it's Halloween day and the kids go out trick or treating and they come back, there's some things that happen off screen that we get caught up to speed on. I think that with some tweaking and maybe a few extra minutes to the episode, um, in a hypothetical sense, would have helped build more tension earlier than that, and we could have actually got to explore Halloween a bit more, and explore the festivities, and perhaps see more of the Cutty Black Sal stalking the kids, and perhaps that could have been the reason why they cut trick or treating short and go home, because he thinks to check the pebbles, and that's where he discovers Pebble. That's the only tweak I would make, and keep everything else the same in a rudimentary sense. But I feel like there's a mid portion missing in this story there. And I also do think that the budget at times can be kind of showy, especially with like the eye effects for the Cuddy Black Sow. That's all we see. And like I said, it's deliberately done to kind of mask the actual monster, so the reveal makes it more scarier for the kids watching. Because you can definitely tell that this episode was made for more kids in mind than adults. Let's be real. So I can understand that from a technical aspect, but I do think that they did kind of skip out on utilizing the monster more to help with the tension. They kind of over relied on the fake outs. I feel like the whole sister with the mask thing, getting payback for him pranking her with the mask. Like I felt like that was the point of the episode where I'm like, okay, can we get over this fake out stuff? Like, can we just get over it and actually get to the Cuddy? But woulda, coulda, shoulda. All said and done, I'd probably give this episode the same score I gave Shadow Man, 4 out of 5 stars. That's with my blended score, with it being an adult horror show, but using the kids horror curve kind of mixed in there. I think it's about similarly on par. Just has its own different issues. So that's where I'm at with it. Unless anybody else wants to add on, we can move on to BD and hear his thoughts on Cuddy Black Sal.
I guess
All
for
right.
my I guess for my thoughts, I thought it was pretty good. I didn't quite as like love it as much as Monster Blood did, which is fine. But I think that overall, with the positives involving the episode, definitely the kid actors. I was actually very impressed by the kid actors in this episode. Gloria is adorable. I love every scene that she's in. She does a good job acting, and Jamie is a very compelling kid character. Mostly for the fact that you hear those stories or those typical jokes that like your older family members will be like, oh yeah, back in my day, you guys are soft in this generation. Back in my day, I used to walk 8 miles to get to school. Here, Jamie has to watch his great grandma pass away and then immediately turn into the protector of the house against the ancient folklore demon. That is a lot for an 8-year-old kid to deal with, especially on Halloween nights. So yeah, Jamie is a very good character. He does a good job acting as well. He plays pretty much a serious role throughout the entire episode, but he's a very smart kid. He actually listens to the great grandmother. In this case, he does not try to play around with the folklore. He tries to actually respect it and do the best that he can, which makes that twist ending more effective. I also thought another positive was the scene with the great grandma. There is a short story by Stephen King called Grandma. And that whole short story is about basically a kid dealing with very creepy scenes involving weird behavior from his grandma. Here it's a similar thing. You see throughout the entire episode a little bit too much that they keep reusing the same shot of Jamie's eyes in the beginning of the episode where he's just staring ominously at his great grandma as she's like rambling away. And the parents don't know anything about what she's talking about. Gloria is still a little innocent in her own world, but Jamie's very intent. He's looking straight at his grandma and paying attention to everything that she's saying. And on the night of All Hallows Eve, when she's about to pass away, he takes down notes and tape records and listens to her. So I thought that was very cool. It was very creepy hearing the great grandma talk about the folklore. And the twist ending is good. That goes without saying. I like the fact that they actually went with prosthetics. I got a little bit scared that we weren't going to see as much as we wanted to from a certain entity, but we do. They do go full showing it, so I thought that was pretty good. As for the weaknesses, I do have to say that some of the weaknesses stem from the fact that, like Monster Blood said, it is a Tales from the Dark Side good episode, which is a different standard to most other shows because, again, Tales from the Dark Side is pretty much known for limited budgets, kind of just one setting, one focal point area that they tend to not leave from. With this episode, I feel like the lack of budget sort of you kind of notice in certain places when it comes specifically to the middle section and third act. Again, they don't go out on Halloween night. It all takes place within the house. And the Cuddy Black Sow is not shown for a majority of the episode. It's just your generic glowing eyes that look like it's from a toy. And then the kind of tropes that you get about scratching on the window, the wind rattling the window, that's all sort of typical stuff that did not really impress me that much. It's fine. It's good for what it is, but it's just nothing that overall stands out. And there is a lot of fake outs that happen towards that third act. First, you get the girl, Gloria, who basically fakes out with scaring in a mask. Then the parents fake out Jamie by scaring him. And then the dad does a third fake out towards the final act, which gets recontextualized into something. So a lot of fake outs. They don't really utilize the Cuddy Black cell the best way I thought possible. I feel like they could have used it way more. And I understand the lack of budget, but at the same time, there's other monster focused episodes in Tales from the Dark Side that did have a lot of showing the monster. One that pops up in my mind is Inside the Closet, like the closet episode in the first season. That one had really good monster effects and a lot of monster focus. There's one called Monsters in the Closet about a little kid with monsters that has a lot of focus as well. So I feel like that was underutilized. And involving the twist ending, there's a certain thing that the Cuddy Black Sow does, potentially involving shapeshifting, which felt a little random only because I did read the Cemetery Dance, I believe, comic adaptation of the Cuddy Black Sow. And in that twist ending, Jamie actually never fully confronts the dad. He pretty much does not have any dialogue. He's inside of his bed. He's sort of just assuming that his dad walks in, and when he turns around, it's quite the horrific sight. So the ending to this episode sort of changed it up. I actually preferred that ending to this one. And just as a minor thing, this is not that big, but every time the Cuddy Black Sow gets mentioned or shown, there is volume boosted bagpipes, Scottish bagpipes, which is a little much. I was like, okay, bro. Like, imagine if they were telling an African folklore and you just heard volume boosted bongo drums, or if you're listening to an Indian folklore and you hear somebody going crazy on the sitar. It's like, all right, we get it. We get it. We know it's Scottish. That's a little much. But overall, it's a pretty good episode. I definitely think that people would remember this one. As for it being the most scary, I can kind of understand it. If you saw this as a kid, especially that twist ending, you probably would get paranoid. I can imagine myself as a kid, probably like on a night where I'm staying by myself when my mom has to go out. I'm probably looking around the corner, especially if it's a stormy night. It can get under your skin, even as an adult, if you picture yourself as an 8-year-old boy of all things. So yeah, pretty good. Nothing that I loved, but for Tales from the Dark Side, wow, this is a gem. So all of you should definitely check it out at some point or another.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think that, the Cuddy Black Sow and the Shadow Man both have these reputations in prospective shows. Like, both are supposed to be one of the scariest episodes in their prospective franchises. For Cuddy Black Sow, it was apparently so scary that it never got re-aired because it scarred children. So it must have been doing something right there. And the Shadow Man has been hailed by many Twilight Zone fans to be the scariest episode in the whole franchise for many years. I don't know if you can really say that with a hard confidence. That's a tall order. One, I'm assuming that you've seen every iteration of Twilight Zone out there, people saying that, but I can kind of see it, like I said. Um, so these two, had these reputations. They might not be on everybody's top 10 favorite episodes. They might not be on everybody's, radar, but they are for certain both fan favorite episodes in their respective franchises. And for what they kind of serve a great purpose of what Platinum Age Kids Horror was starting to produce. And that is a niche in the horror market to carve out for kids. Obviously, that it's apparent that these shows know that at least back then, kids were watching them. This is probably on prime time, television back then. This was, back then, cable television was brand new in the 80s. So majority of families still only had whatever channels they can get free on their television, with the satellite. So, and their antenna. So both of these shows were on public access, right? These were on channels that you can get. So obviously kids are going to be watching and tuning in. So they they found that kids can be marketed with horror, and we learned that when Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark came out in 1992. And I think both of these kind of echo what Platinum Age was kind of experimenting around with is, how far can you push it with kids being the protagonist of the story? Like, do you harm them throughout the story? Do you harm them in the end? And it's a common trope. Like kids in these Platinum Age stories, they can have crappy endings. they don't sugarcoat it. I mean, they get some dark things that happen to them. And it's kind of showing, but a lot of these tropes that you see in Cutty Black Sal and Shadow Man, you can see later on, especially when Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps started to come on the scene. I mean, especially with Shadow Man, the geek trope in Goosebumps, playing with the loaded gun. That's been done a few times in kids' horror. Cutty Black Sal, the folklore legend, the active protagonist kid hero that gets a crappy ending. That's, these are reoccurring themes. So they're both very solid episodes. And for me, I think it's kind of tough to decide which one is better than the other because I think they're both even, but they both have their own strengths over the other, right? I think I really like the characters more in Cutty Black Sal. I think the mood and atmosphere is a bit more darker and brooding in that episode. But I will say that I think Shadow Man has more moving parts. There's more character development, I should say, at least, maybe not the most enriching thing, but there's like character progression. And I will say that the story is a bit more active than Cutty Black Sal's is, but it's kind of lacking a thematic punch, right? So weighing the options here, which one I prefer over the other. Um, Honestly, I'm gonna make my decision once you guys say what you prefer because it can go either way, and I want to hear your thoughts and see which one of you can sway me on this. So whoever wants to take it, let's figure out which one you prefer over the other.
Well, I guess I can go. I think I definitely know that Monster Blood's gonna pick Shadow Man, and I'm gonna pick Cutty Black Sal. Yeah. So overall, Cutty Black Sal is pretty good, but I have to give it to Shadow Man mainly because I always base my picks and what I enjoy off of entertainment factor, and I have to say that Shadow Man, there is really no slow parts. It is kind of like a perfect package in terms of pacing. There's always something going on. There's always a moving part. And particularly, although Jamie from Cutty Black Sal is a compelling character, I feel like all the other characters in the story should kind of be supporting. But for Cutty Black Sal, once the grandma dies, it becomes very one character focused. Everybody else is sort of just there for fake out. While as when you watch the Shadow Man, there is the main character, but his friend plays a role. The bully has his own kind of compelling story where you sort of feel more sympathetic towards the bully by the end. And of course, the Shadow Man is its own interesting figure. And I feel like Twilight Zone managed to use its urban legend better because the Shadow Man is shown throughout it. That might be because of more budget or whatever may be it. You see more of the Shadow Man. You see the Shadow Man actually getting active, and it's not only just targeting eventually the main character, it's also targeting the entire town. The entire town is getting attacked by this thing. There's a sense of paranoia, and that really builds up the urban legend. And the ending even really feels like a twist ending you would get from like a scary stories to tell in the dark tale. So overall, I just feel like it's a kind of better package. There's no real slow point. For the Cuddy Black Sow, the beginning is strong, the ending is strong, but I really feel like that middle section is just lacking. And once you divert your attention away, you only get it back during that very, very twist ending. So I have to give it to Shadowman.
Okay, fair points. All right, Monster Blood, you have the floor. Which one do you prefer?
So I will admit that I think Shadow Man does have a bit more action to it. There's a little bit more going on. There's a bit more scenery. And you could also argue that, the plot's a little bit more imaginative with like the urban legend and the Shadow Man going on. And it's a bit more thought provoking, I guess you could say. But I think the real reason I like Cuddy Black Sow so much and where the Shadow Man really kind of lacks for me is in the characters and in the sort of like emotional connection that you have to them. I feel like I didn't really care too much about what happened to the characters in the Shadow Man. I didn't really feel like I had that emotional connection to them. And I feel like the kid actors in the Cutty Black Sow did a lot better job, especially with them being so young. And the main character, with him having the role of the hero, like completionist mentioned, and I just felt like I kind of connected with him a lot more. And they did a really good job at sort of just transferring the emotions that that character felt to the viewer. And I didn't really get that sense from the Shadow Man. So I think that's a large part of why the Cutty Black Sow just kind of resonated with me a bit more. And yeah, Cutty Black Sow to me is definitely the superior episode in this case.
Okay, fair points. You know, I guess I'll, add one more thing here. You know, one thing about Shadow Man that I really love is that it feels like a long lost haunting hour episode. But on the same token to that, the characters feel like a dime a dozen that you've already seen countless of times in kids horror, and they don't really stand out for a particular reason. But despite that, I think the utilization of the comparison here to Cuddy Black Sow of the urban legend is a bit better here. BD's already brought up the pace and the moving parts makes the story more active feeling, and it feels like it goes places other than Cuddy Black Sow, where it feels like you kind of experience it on the whim and you arrive at a certain place. Which it's all based on preference at the end of the day, but in terms of storytelling, I do think that having more moving parts does kind of give Shadow Man the edge a little bit. Um, and I also think that Shadow Man's twist ending is a little more ambiguous and perhaps more memorable in the sense, I think, in the grand scheme of it all, because of the ambiguity, which can be a good or bad thing. So Shadow Man has some strong positives, but I'm not going to discount Cuddy Black Sow either because, like Monster Blood said, I think Janie's a strong, emotional, empathetic character. And for him being an 8-year-old kid, he really does stand out in the mix of kids' horror stories. I mean, you don't see them that young that often. And for him being as heroic as he is, and him kind of taking the weight of this burden to protect his family and his grandmother's soul, even is very, very deep for a kid. And that might have been some of the first time that kids back then probably got to experience something like this with a kid around their own age. A lot of them probably didn't understand what it was like or see what it was like to lose a grandparent. It probably made them think about that for the first time in their life. So for that, I mean, I do think that the characters are a bit better overall in Cuddy Black Sow. I do think that the monster is a little more up my alley with the Cuddy Black Sow. I do like the folklore aspect that intrigues me more. I do like using, you know, the mechanics that Jamie offers, like the tape recordings and stuff, to help them solve and figure out how to, at least attempt to thwart the Cuddy Black Sow is very interesting. You just don't see that inventiveness with characters. And him getting the bad ending, I don't want to spoil exactly what it is, but it makes me think, like I said, to some of my favorite Goosebumps and Are You Afraid of the Dark tales that have a very similar, if not same executed idea there. So when it comes to which one I prefer, it really comes down to one thing and one thing only, and that is the writing. Like I said, I think Shadow Man is a bit better written, um, at least in how it comes across in the story than Cuddy Black Sow. But I think Cuddy Black Sow is able to make you feel a lot more, and there is messages in Cuddy Black Sow as well about honoring your family's legacy and what that entails. And the fact that the kid is so young, it stands out in stories that kind of echo the same idea there. I feel like Cuddy Black Sow needed less tweaks for me to give it a higher score than Shadow Man. Because Shadow Man at the end of the day felt a little too basic in its concept structure, as in Cuddy Black Sow felt a little too basic because of budget and what they were able to do with it. So I think I'm going to give the edge, surprisingly, to Cuddy Black Sow. Surprisingly, but it's by a hair. It's very close. You can ask me tomorrow. I might prefer Shadow Man. I might regret this decision, but this time around, I think I really did think that Darkseid produced a solid episode. And it's very rare because Darkseid, when they produce a solid episode, like y'all said, it's Darkseid good. That does not equate to the average mean of good. Don't get it twisted. There's very, very, very few episodes that I think Darkseid produced that go toe to toe with stuff from Creepshow or Tales from the Crypt. Legitimately, there's very few. But this one, I like. I genuinely like this. And I like Shadow Man too. It sucks you got to pick one, but I'm gonna give it to Cutty Black Sal and give the victory there. But it's a reluctant victory. It's reluctant. I don't want to have to choose, but if I had to, it's that one. All right. Anything else you want to add before we get into our discussion? All right. So to round out this podcast, y'all, this was some of the first exposure that we've had to Platinum Age Kids Horror as a group here, at least. And I just want to give the floor the attention here. Platinum Age Kids Horror, as you guys have come to know, what is your thoughts and your experiences on stuff that's come out before Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps that you feel really does echo what they would later do, but you see the stuff being done before those things ever came out?
I guess I can go. I'm just gonna talk about like the Tales from the Dark Side, two other episodes that were kid focused. That's gonna be Mookie and Pookie, and I believe Monsters in the Closet was the name of it. It's kind of funny, Platinum Age Kids Horror, because you can tell that they were really trying to figure out what they wanted to do. And it's always interesting to go back further than what we typically know, because whenever you hear kids horror, of course, what we cover on our channels, being Goosebumps, Haunting Hour, Are You Afraid of the Dark, and even other series like Bone Chillers and stuff. That's all the mainstream kids horror. But seeing the prototypes is kind of interesting because a lot of them have stuff that you would see repeated later on. We just talked about two of them, but for Mookie and Pookie, when I had seen this episode, I couldn't help but feel like this is the prototype to what Are You Afraid of the Dark would become. Because unlike most Platinum Age kids horror, Mookie and Pookie is actually a pretty heartfelt one. And it's actually more kind of like Kumbaya ending, which Are You Afraid of the Dark is known for. Basically, Mookie and Pookie is about these two siblings that live in like your typical sort of family, but the brother is very sick and he's about to die. But he is basically a prodigy when it comes to technology and computers, which his rest of the family is not really aware of. So what ends up happening is he ends up finding a way to actually download his consciousness and put it within a computer, almost like a AI system before that stuff was even conceived. So as he passes away, he ends up still being alive in the computer. And he explains this to his sister cryptically, but she's not able to convey that to her parents. So her parents want to get rid of the computer. They want her to stop programming and stop finishing the project that her brother was into. But she continues to keep on doing it in the hopes of basically bringing back her brother into the family. And you get your sort of typical tropes about like the limits and powers of technology, the family bonds and stuff like that. So that felt like Are You Afraid of the Dark? Are You Afraid of the Dark typically always goes for the more heartfelt, emotional stuff. And I feel like if you guys like that show, not just the most fan favorite episodes, but if you like the way that Are You Afraid of the Dark typically makes its episodes, Mookie and Pookie is an interesting one. And in terms of kind of scariest episodes that you would feel like parents would probably protest, there was a Tales from the Dark Side episode called Monsters in the Closet. Basically, about what we had talked about. A kid has this kind of abusive stepfather, and every single night that he goes to sleep, there are these various horrific monsters. Again, we talked about Michael McDowell. This feels like the type of stuff Michael McDowell would probably make and part of the Beetlejuice franchise. These are some very weird, odd looking, kind of whimsical monsters that basically appear in his closet, under his bed, in his room. And every single night he's getting terrified by it until eventually he starts to lose his fear and you might get some comeuppance. And it is quite dark. In this case, not for the kid solely, but also for somebody else in the story. That one was actually quite scary. I feel like if I had seen that as a kid, the monsters were very terrifying. The idea of basically being isolated to your room where there's monsters and there also being a human monster outside of your room is very interesting because most of the time when you're scared of the dark or scared of something under your bed, you go to your parents. But what if your parent is a monster themselves? They're not somebody you can rely upon. So you basically get cornered and isolated. And the monsters in his room basically kind of represent his mental state. Like they all sort of represent how scared he is, how terrified he is all the time. And he has to conquer those mental demons, which are kind of manifested in the real world, in order to get rid of his physical demon in the human form. So it was really interesting. I really liked that episode. The more and more I think about it, it had a good plot and it had a good use of like sort of practical effects and stuff. So yeah, that's my kind of Platinum Kids horror thing. I think that it's really interesting to see some of the old stuff because again, it laid the foundation. And although they didn't really know what they were doing, surprisingly, they kind of had good execution on a lot of the stories from Tales from the Dark Side that involve kids. And we talked about a lot of them outside of Mookie and Pookie. All the ones that I've seen have been pretty good. So yeah, shout out to everybody out there back during the 80s and 70s who were trying this stuff. You guys did a surprisingly good job, and I'm thoroughly impressed because some of that stuff has not been repeated till this day. So you guys pretty much stood out.
Yeah, and kind of build off that, there was no kids horror market whatsoever, right? So they were kind of like planting the seeds of what would become, Are You Afraid of the Dark and Goosebumps? But at the same time, they were making shows for adults, but they had to like backdoor in some content for kids from time to time. And you see this going on even in Tales from the Crypt and Monsters, which came after Dark Side. But the market was starting to form, because of these experiments. Like, hey, why don't we try an episode kid focused and see what happens? And of course, word of mouth spreads, kids are watching, ratings are still up. Hey, why don't we try this untested market out? And some people took the chance on it. And then look what became in the 90s. I mean, Goosebumps became a juggernaut in book selling history. I mean, Are You Afraid of the Dark joined the Snick Block in the founding years of what became the iconic years of Nickelodeon and became one of the most watched live action Nickelodeon shows ever at the time. I mean, it was groundbreaking, for the horror genre to branch out to kids, which was unheard of, especially in the late 80s. But stuff started to balloon in that time period. And it's very intriguing just to observe stuff from the 80s and maybe as early as the late 70s, because those were the times where they were starting to slowly introduce it. But of course, it was a different time back then, right? They weren't quite ready to make that jump yet. So they would do it in small doses. I mean, there's countless of movies we can talk about if you want to, from Disney, for example, when Disney tried to make family friendly horror movies. I mean, the list goes on. People were trying it. People thought it would fail, but it didn't, surprisingly. I'm going to pass it over to Monster Blood. Monster Blood, what's your thoughts on what you've experienced in the platinum age of kids' horror?
So I just have one episode that I want to mention, and that is from the TV series Tales from the Crypt, which has already been mentioned. It was an anthology show that ran from, I believe, 89 to like 97. It ran for 7 seasons. And there's one episode in that show that I believe is from season 2, if I remember correctly. And it is called The Secret. And it is probably one of my favorite episodes of that show, and only one of like 2 or 3 episodes they did that was focused on kids and had like a young kid as the main character. This was a very adult show that had like nudity and some pretty graphic violence in it at times. So it's kind of interesting that they did a couple episodes focused around kids as the characters. And not only that, but the material in the episodes themselves was pretty like age appropriate for the most part. I mean, there was still some violent stuff in them, but like a kid could get away with watching it. And The Secret is a really cool episode because it reminds me so much of like a Goosebumps type story. And again, this doesn't predate Goosebumps by a lot. I think this would have aired in probably like 90 or 91, maybe around there. And then Goosebumps came out in 92. So it doesn't predate Goosebumps by like a lot. But it feels so much like a Goosebumps story. The premise is basically where you have this kid that's at this orphanage, and he has these new foster parents that come and adopt him, and he goes to live with them, and they seem very nice at first and give him everything he wants. They like kind of spoil him. They give him all these toys and feed him well, but they're a little weird. He has some suspicions that kind of arise about them. They have some weird rules. They don't really like to let him go out of the house. They kind of keep him like locked up in this room all the time, and they're feeding him a lot of food. And there's also this sort of like butler or caretaker, if I remember correctly, that lives with these people. And he kind of builds this friendship with this new kid that's moved into the family. And he kind of, it's been a while since I've seen it, but if I remember correctly, I think he kind of lets the kid know that there's something not right with his new parents. And I think he tries to help him. And the kid tries to like kind of make his escape when he learns that his new foster parents are not exactly well intentioned and maybe have some kind of secret that they're not telling him. And then we get a fantastic twist ending that just screams goosebumps. Just it feels like a goosebump story through and through. I don't know how else to describe it. And yeah, it's just a super fun episode, and it really stands out in the show again because this was a very adult television show, and it was just interesting to see them kind of tackle a concept like this. And I would have liked to see more episodes like this on the show. But yeah, this is a great episode, and yeah, that's really the only mention that I have of something that kind of feels like kids horror that came out before the kids horror boom.
Yeah, and, I talked about that episode in a video I did about adult horror anthology episodes. I feel like kids horror. That one screamed goosebumps to me too. I mean, like it was probably the most goosebumps feeling story that happened prior to Goosebumps. And like you said, it was like maybe a year or two before Goosebumps came on the scene. But it kind of proved a proof of concept that even on a cable network like HBO, they were also testing to see if they can sneak in an episode targeted to kids and see if kids were watching, right? Who knows, how they were measuring data back then, or, feedback from reviews or whatnot. But I'm assuming that they had to have known that kids were watching, right? Because cable back then, it wasn't as nearly as expansive nowadays. I mean, like you maybe had Showtime, HBO, and maybe a few other stations that you might be able to get your like USA Network or TNT or TBS, but there wasn't a lot because I had cable back then. I can attest to you in the mid '90s, cable was probably less than 100 channels. But you got more than standard TV, right? So, you know, there wasn't a lot for kids to ingest. And obviously, if kids are watching and kids are helping spread the word of mouth to your show, that obviously maybe it's a smart move to make content towards kids outright, right? So that's why I think it's important to look at these episodes from Tales from the Crypt, Tales from the Dark Side, because these are the proof of concepts that show these creators and the networks that are producing the shows that, hey, maybe they're onto something. Maybe we should step up and provide it, right? And CBS, Viacom, Paramount, they made Tales from the Dark Side. They made Monsters. They made Twilight Zone from the 1980s. I mean, they were involved in all of that. And guess what? Nickelodeon's owned by Viacom. They put a kids horror show to Nickelodeon. Bam, boom, there you go. Rest is history. They already know the proof of concept is there. So, to me, like looking at these episodes, obviously they had a blueprint from somewhere. They probably told these creators that had the idea that possibly were influenced by watching these material to say, hey, why don't you aim to make something like Mookie and Pookie, or aim to make something like this? Watch this and then put your own spin on it and see where it goes. And it's fascinating to me. To me, I think I've experienced a lot of Platinum Age kids horror movies, television, anthology, whatever have you, and they all have similar running themes and tropes. Like two common ones that I see is that kids have crappy lives. Like in the case of The Secret, you talk about him being an orphan. He has like poor parents. I mean, that was done in a Monsters episode, Parents from Space. She's a foster kid. She has abusive parents or parents that don't have her best interests at heart. She comes across a secret that can potentially give her some power, just like the secret from Tales from the Crypt. I mean, there's a lot of parallels there, but they were experimenting around with what they can get away with kids. As we'll see later on, they kind of started putting the kitty gloves on, and they stopped doing as mature of themes as they probably could have gotten away with still, even for 90s standards. I think they could have easily pushed the envelopes farther, but as the 90s rolled around and as kids horror was becoming more mainstream, obviously you have advertisers and people looking to make money off the property, so they don't want to make the advertisers mad by putting something controversial out. Like, imagine if Goosebumps put out as is The Secret as an episode on their show. Given the violence in that episode, I think that would have gone a little too far, and I don't think Fox Kids would have been happy with that. But like I said, these things existed before there was a gauge on what is appropriate, right? So it's fascinating, like I said, and I honestly like pretty much every episode to a degree from this period of time. I've seen Mookie and Pookie. I think it's decent. It's not my favorite. It's probably my least favorite of the ones, but I think it's decent. I've seen Parents from Space. I've seen Mr. Labber. I've seen Shadow Man. I've seen Monsters in the Closet. You know, all of them. And I think they have endless charm and rewatchability to a degree. Some more than others, but I would rewatch them because they feel like what I already know and love with kids horror nowadays. And if you've seen like the Big Two and you've seen Haunting Hour and you've seen everything that you think you've seen, go watch some of these Platinum Age stories. See where it all began. It might shock you, it might surprise you. I think one of these episodes can end up possibly being one of your fan favorites or favorites of all time, like BD. Shadow Man might be one of your favorite kids' horror stories of all time. Monster Blood, Cutty Black Style might be one of your favorites of all time. So, like, it goes to show that these are worthwhile to go check out. Anything else you guys want to add before we close? No? All right. Well, that was fun talking about Platinum Age Kids Horror. Let us know down in the comment section if you are a fan of 80s Twilight Zone, if you're a fan of Tales from the Dark Side. What's your thoughts on the 2 episodes we discussed? And also, what's your thoughts on the time period we were going over? Like I said, we're going over pre-1992 kids horror. If you're around back then, what was it like being a kid growing up with these shows? And what was it like seeing these episodes for the first time? That would be very intriguing to chat with you all about. Also, maybe drop some support over to my fellow patrons here while you're at it. I know Monster Blood is in semi-retirement, but if you want to check out his backlog of videos that he has available, if you want to go check out his Goodreads page, his letterbox, I'll put all of that in the description. Go check out what he's putting out there. If you are not a part of the Discord where we are all involved in, I could possibly give you that if you want that, so you can chat with all of us. For at least with the folks that aren't as active anymore. So I'll provide that if you want it. And please go sub up Horrorlander. He has, I believe, an Instagram. He has a YouTube page, and he makes great content. Go drop him some support. He's recently hit a great channel milestone for him. I'm really proud of him. Let's keep him growing, and let's also keep my channel growing. Why don't we both hit 2K at the same time? Can we please get to 2K? That'd be great, y'all. It keeps me informed that you guys are watching, you guys are liking the content, and we'll keep making Goosejunkies podcast episodes for you all, and we'll keep providing solo content as usual. We love talking about kids horror on this podcast each and every time. So if you think that we deserve it, drop a like, drop a sub, and go check out our playlist and check out past videos that we've done. You might be able to catch something that you didn't know we've already covered. Until next time, we're going to keep our next podcast special or episode a surprise. We're not going to reveal it. You're just going to have to experience it when it comes. So I hope the surprise is going to be worthwhile. And I hope that what we decide to pick to talk about next will satisfy all of you out there. But until next time, we hope you enjoyed this episode, and we hope you have a great evening. Take care.
Deuces.